Hey there, church family. This was week 7 of the E100 reading series, and this week, Israel got a king. Or actually 2 kings this week. We looked at the book of Samuel, and we started at the beginning of 1 Samuel, and we went to 2 Samuel chapter 7. Last week, Israel was in a pretty dark place. The promises to Abraham were being fulfilled, but Israel was in shambles, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And when we began this week, Israel's in the same place. And we find that even the priests in the temple are corrupt. Eli's sons are thieves and fornicators, and they oppress God's people while their father looks on and doesn't do anything. But God is at work in the wife of a Levite man. Hannah is barren, and she's persecuted by her rival. But Hannah is a woman of prayer, and God gives to her a child, Samuel. And this great reversal in her own life leads to a prayer in chapter 2. This prayer talks about the Lord's control over all things, over victory and defeat, abundance and hunger, childlessness and childbirth, wealth and poverty, and even over life and death. But she also speaks of a great reversal that God is doing. He brings down the mighty and raises up the weak. He raises up the poor and lifts up the needy. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. This prayer, which introduces the book, has many similarities to a song sung at the end of the book of Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel were originally one book. And at the beginning and end, there's these songs that have very similar phrases and concepts. And in 2 Samuel 22, David sings about God as his rock, and he sings about God rescuing him when he was weak and destroying his powerful enemies. And these bookends help show us how to interpret the events throughout the book. God is the one who's in control of history, and he delights in tearing down the prideful, but lifting up those who trust in him. And we see that in the book. The powerful and wicked family of Eli is torn down as him and his 2 sons all die in the same day. We read the prophecy about that, and that actually happens in chapter 4. But God replaces him with humble and faithful Samuel. Later, God would raise up humble Saul to the throne. But when he stopped being humble and turned against God in pride, God tore him down and raised up a shepherd boy, David, to be king in his place. So let's look at those 2 men, Saul and David. In 2 Samuel 8, the people ask the Lord for a king. And both Samuel and the Lord are unhappy with this request. Now, this can be a source of confusion for some. And it's important to note that the desire for a king is not in and of itself a bad thing. Previously, God promised to Abraham and Sarah that they would have kings descend from them. And when Jacob prophesied over his children, God promised a king would descend from Judah who would rule the world. And most importantly, God's law said that it was okay for the people to have a king. Deuteronomy 17 lays out the conditions of that and the roles and actions of what that king is supposed to do. The issue is not specifically that they want a king. It's the motivation for doing so. Specifically, the text tells us that they ask because they rejected the Lord's rule over them, and because they want to be like all the nations around. And so if they want a king like the nations around them, they're going to get a king like the nations. God warns them of a tyrant. Through Samuel, he talks about a tyrant who's going to rule over them and tax them and oppress his own people. Rejecting the Lord's rule never leaves us in a better place. But Saul starts out pretty good. He seems genuinely humble, and he's a giant of a man, a head taller than everyone else, and certainly that seems like the kind of guy you'd want to rule over you and lead you into battle. But Saul turns bad. There's a few stories, we didn't read all of them, but Saul's power goes to his head. He takes matters into his own hands, and he defies clear commands from the Lord. And as a result, the Lord rejects Saul as king, and Samuel anoints his replacement, David, a youngest son and a shepherd boy. Not an obvious choice for the throne, but the text tells us man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And David is a man after God's own heart. And because God is with him, whatever he does, he begins to succeed in. His first battle is a spiritual one against the demons plaguing his predecessor. And his second battle is against a giant who defies God's people. While the Israelites and Saul himself is cowering in fear, David steps out in faith and defeats God's enemy, striking a blow to the head of Goliath, striking a blow to the head of this offspring of the serpent. While David is rising in fame and power and ability, everything Saul does is failing. God is tearing down prideful Saul, and Saul spends more and more of his time obsessed with killing David, while even Saul's son, Jonathan, knows who's God's anointed and sides with David. But David has faith in God's timing, even in this, and he doesn't take things into his own hands. He has an opportunity at one point to strike Saul dead, and he would have got away with it too. But he leaves things into God's hands. He leaves vengeance to the Lord, and he trusts in his timing, doesn't strike out against the Lord's anointed. So when Saul does die and David is crowned king, we read in 2 Samuel 7, one of the most important texts in understanding Scripture. David decides that it'd be a great idea to build a house for the Lord. After all, the Ark of the Covenant is sitting in a tent. And David thinks, I'm going to build the Lord a house. But the Lord gives him a message through the prophet Nathan and says, you will not build me a house. I will build you a house. And there's a play on words there. David intends to build a house, a physical building, a structure. But God intends to build up the house of David. That is, give him a dynasty. God promises that after David, his son, would rise up and he would build the temple. More than that, David is promised that he will always have a son to reign on the throne. Individual kings will be punished when they stray, but God will cause David's line to last forever. The problems we've seen about how would Israel survive and what hope do they have for the future start to be tied up in this promise that they would forever have a king to lead them. Now, there's only two ways that this can happen. Either David's son has a son who has a son who has a son, and each of them reign on the throne continually without any breaks in perpetuity. Or David has one son who lives forever. As we go on in Israel's history, we'll see God's faithfulness to David's sons and each king after David in his line. But there comes a point when the nation will go into exile, and the king will be no more. And the prophets will look back on this exact passage. They'll look back on 2 Samuel 7 and the promise God made there to David. And they'll look forward to a day when God will fulfill his promise. They'll say, there's no king right now. There's no descendant of David on the throne, but one day he's going to come. Right? And different prophets talk about this hope in different ways. Isaiah talks about the root of Jesse. Ezekiel talks about a new David. And there's this hope of a coming king who will reign over all the earth. And it's in fulfillment of this promise that's right here. And that's how our New Testaments start, right? The first verse in the book of Matthew. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. The whole desire that people had in Israel of a Messiah coming was founded on the conviction that however dark things looked, God was going to keep his promises, and he was going to keep his promise to David, and a king would come from his descendants who would reign on the throne. This is also the foundation of our understanding that Jesus now sits at the right hand of the Father, ruling the world until he puts all things under his feet. So, what have we seen? First, we saw God raises up the humble and lowly who trust in him, but he tears down the mighty and powerful who defy him, right? The raising up of the humble, think of Hannah, Samuel, David. The tearing down of the powerful and arrogant, think of Eli or Saul or Goliath. And then second, we saw David is promised an everlasting throne, a kingdom that will stand forever. And that's a promise that we can hold on to today because we know that Christ will reign over all the earth forever. How can these truths encourage us today? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for joining us on this E100 series, and see you next week.